Thanks, Conrad, and thanks to everyone who's come here today. I'm going to start with a different question to that which the meeting addresses, and that is, can Corbyn win the election? It's an important question. It is undoubtedly a very crucial vote that's going to take place on the 12th of December, which will have big implications. And my answer to can Corbyn win the election is an unequivocal yes. We shouldn't think that the polls tell us the whole truth about what's going to happen. If you look at the equivalent moment in the 2017 general election, the Labour Party was 22.5% behind the Tories. It's much, much smaller than that this time. On the election day itself, as we know, in 2017, the result was that the Tories were 2.5% ahead of the Labour Party, the biggest increase in percentage point terms for the Labour Party since 1945. A very considerable advance which can happen again, and therefore we have to think about how that can happen. If you look at the polls, one of the things that they're based upon is a number of assumptions about who will vote on the 12th of December. So it assumes, for example, that of 18 to 24-year-olds who are registered, just 31% will actually vote on the 12th of December. In 2017, the figure was 58% of 18 to 24-year-olds. So it assumes a big fall. I think that could well be wrong. And people like you, as well as people like me, can help to make it a reality that more people between the ages of 18 and 24 vote in the election. It assumes as well that only 40% of 25 to 34-year-olds will vote. The actual figure in 2017 was 62%. So it's an assumption that younger people will not be voting in 2019 who voted in 2017. I think that's probably an incorrect assumption. That's just one example of how the polls can be wrong about what happens on the 12th of December. More fundamentally, there's an extraordinary volatility in electoral behaviour in Britain and actually across Europe and other parts of the world. It is true that if you look at the 1950s and the 1960s, people often voted the same way all through their lives, either for the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, because it was a time when between them they took 80% or more of the vote in every election. That is not true anymore. In the period between 2010 and 2017, and here I'm basing myself on the British election study which came out recently, between 2010 and 2017, half of people changed their vote. So if you look at how people voted in 2010, by 2017, half of them were voting the alternative way. To a huge churn of voting behaviour amongst people. How are we to understand that? It is because there is a deep hunger for change inside society. I'm sure that you've been in meetings yesterday and today which have talked about the global revolt in Chile, in Iraq, in Iran now, in Ecuador, and so on, the whole number of places, based upon deep bitterness at economic exclusion and hatred of a corrupt political elite. Britain is not at the same pitch or scale of Hong Kong or Lebanon or Chile, but the same factors are present. The same sense of resentment about the 1% and those who cluster around them becoming increasingly rich, and the reality for many people is declining wages, falling apart social services, cutbacks in the council, lack of a future for their kids, and for a lot of people, food banks, the vicious regime of universal credit and sanctions, and so on. So there is that deep bitterness. There's an opinion poll last week. I've told you not to listen to the polls, but I'll raise this one, which showed that 60% of people think that the economy needs radical or moderate change. and only 2% of people thought that the economy works well and should go on as it is at the moment. That's an extraordinary lack of support for the way that things are. And in this maelstrom, this tumult of people looking for a new way forward, big shifts of opinion can take place on the scale as occurred in 2017, when we know that the Radical Manifesto, compared to those of Blair or Brown or Ed Miliband, combined with a campaign of mass rallies, of confident campaigning and so on, enabled a big shift in the vote. I'm not saying that that's inevitable. I had a small wager yesterday on what the final figure of the election will be. And you can come back to this afterwards. I bought the Labour vote at 207. I bet that they would get more than 207 MPs, which I think is a good bet. But, you know, you can don't take my advice on this. Don't wager a single penny on it. Betting is not a clever thing to do. But I'm just telling you what I think, all right? I think Labour can confound the polls. And the first televised debate on Tuesday night, the launch of Labour's manifesto on Thursday, and the subsequent television debate in the first week of December can be important markers along this process. So I think Labour can win. I hope Labour will win. I think that the feeling in society, not just about economics, but about racism, about climate change. If you look at the figures, 50-60% of people say this will be an important element in deciding how they vote. All of this can change what many people on the pundits and the political elite expect to happen on the 12th of December. And after all, it must be highly likely that Boris Johnson is going to provide more and more evidence of his arrogance, of the fact he stands for the people at the top of society, that he doesn't give a damn about ordinary people, and he is going to flounder about trying to make jokey remarks and Latin tags when actually most people know this is a far more serious question that's in front of us. His only hope is to say that the single issue in front of people is that of Brexit and of getting Brexit done. And if the election can be broken away into the class issues that should dominate the campaign, there can be a big change. So I want to say that. Perhaps comrades want to discuss that. Perhaps they don't. Perhaps that's an agreed thing inside the room. But I want to look at a much more important question, which is what happens if Jeremy Corbyn wins. No doubt we will all be rejoicing for a period of a day or days immediately afterwards, and then there will be the harsh reality of seeking to bring the real fundamental shifts that I hope the Labour manifesto will argue for. I have no doubt that it will argue for important changes, the abolition of tuition fees, the increased spending on the National Health Service, an improved programme around housing, free dental care, free dental checkups at least, and a number of important questions. I hope that the attempt by Len McCluskey of the Unite Union to squash the policy that was passed at Labour Party conference over, for example, free movement, that Len McCluskey loses over that, and that it does promise the continuation, the defence and the extension of workers' free movement in society. Anything less than that is a pointer towards blaming migrants for the problems in society and should be rejected. I hope that at the very least the Labour Party conference of putting forward 2030 as the date for when the achievement of zero carbon is reached will be in the manifesto. It may not be. Again, Unite and the GMB unions don't like that sort of pledge because they wrongly think that it will remove jobs for people, when in truth far more jobs could be created by moving from polluting industries to green industries. I hope, though I have no confidence about this, that Labour dishes the pledge for the upgrading and renovation of Trident nuclear missiles, which was in the manifesto of 2017, and is a huge weakness, if you ask me, to say that Labour will be pouring money into nuclear missiles and submarines at a time when it's desperately needed for the things that ordinary people require. So we'll see what happens about this, but then it will be necessary, whatever's achieved, to begin to place that into reality. And here we can see the early shots in what's going to happen. You may have seen ludicrously, Boris Johnson described the pledge to move towards having free broadband for people, a good thing, as broadband communism. This is what he described it as. That this really was going to be the sorts of thing that Lenin would do if he was in any way allowed to win a British election. This was, to put it with the earlier thing that Johnson said, this was the equivalent of Stalin's elimination of the kulaks. I don't know if you know the history of the Russian Revolution. When the Russian Revolution was defeated, Stalin came to power in Russia and wiped out, in their millions, numbers of slightly better off peasants in the Russian countryside. That was what was called the elimination of the kulaks. I very much doubt if Boris Johnson knows anything about that, in truth. But it's a double insult. Firstly, it's a complete insult to suggest that Corbyn is actually going to carry out the murder of millions if he gets into office. It's also, to be honest, a slur upon the scale of the crime that Stalin carried out. Stalin did not just raise taxes on the rich a little bit. He led a counter-revolution against workers, the peasantry, and the vast majority of the nationalities in Russia. And therefore, it's typical of Johnson that mass murder becomes something that's reduced to the level of a small quip. So, but you get the sense of where there's going to be a pressure, a massive pressure on Corbyn. And you can see it beginning as well in the Financial Times yesterday. Labour's BT nationalisation vow sparks fears of investment freeze. In other words, bosses are now saying, Corbyn's pledges around broadband and the renationalisation of part of British Telecom, BT as it's now called, that's going too far. That's going too far. We don't mind a bit more investment here and there. We could even live perhaps with the renationalisation of the railways because they're not very efficient. But don't start messing around with things like BT, which are immensely profitable for us. And then on page 12, the lead editorial, the Thatcher revolution is coming under threat. And it says, Thatcher did wonderful things, don't you know? It was a bit brutal here and there, but she did wonderful things, particularly around privatisation. And now this is all under threat. And we better start recognising that although we don't think much of Johnson, and the Financial Times doesn't think much of Johnson because they think he's done them over Brexit against the interests of big business, we better not think that Corbyn's the answer to this, because the Thatcher revolution is under threat, and we all know, don't we, that that was important in breaking trade union power and enabling an increase in profit rates for all the sorts of people except me who read the Financial Times. Now, that's just a small flavour, an overture to what will happen afterwards. And don't just believe me. Let's have a brief look at the history, and then let's raise our sights to other parts of the world. If you want the real detail, it's all in that green book there. But the last time we had a sort of leftist Labour government elected was in 1974. After a period of very high working class struggle, 2 national miners' strikes, a whole wave of factory occupations, huge level of resistance by the working class that hadn't been seen since the 1920s, and the Labour government was elected on the sorts of pledges, actually, that are quite similar to those that they were making in 2019. The 74 manifesto, it's our intention to bring about a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of power and wealth in favour of working people and their families. I believe that phrase is actually going to be repeated in the 2019 election manifesto. And the Shadow Chancellor, Dennis Healey, who was a very right-wing figure, but nonetheless was caught up in this to some extent, said there would be howls of anguish from people who were rich enough to pay the top rate of tax, and I will squeeze property speculators until the pips squeak. So this was a very, very strong manifesto that was put forward in 1974. Labour won the election and did indeed bring about some changes. There was the repeal of the anti-strike laws that had been pushed through by the Ted Heath government. Before that, there were higher pensions, there were rent subsidies. People actually used to get subsidies to help them pay rents in the great wild days of the 1970s, and the end of the incomes policy, which put a ceiling on how big workers' pay rises could be. There were some undoubted reforms pushed through that government. The immediate response from the people at the top of society was, this has gone too far. There was a big economic crisis coming. It was evidenced by the huge oil increases of the 1973 OPEC organisation. But the crisis was much deeper than that. It was a crisis of profitability, just as it was in 2007, 2008. It was one of the periodic crises that capitalism goes through. And the bosses said to the Labour government, you now have to stop all the reforms, and if you don't, it won't be us who have our pips squeezed, it will be you. And here's, afterwards, he didn't say at the time because it would have been illegal to have done so, but here's the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, the bosses organisation, a man called Campbell Anderson, who said, we certainly discussed an investment strike. Do you remember this? Investment strike, we're not going to invest anything. We also discussed various things about not paying taxes and a list of things which in themselves would not have been legal. Now, that's pretty clear, isn't it? We did things that were unlawful, an investment strike, a run on the pound, an attack upon the bond price, that's the interest rate that governments have to pay to banks and others in order to borrow money, in order to keep the economy going. We did all of that because we knew we could break the Labour government, just as we did with the Labour government in the 1960s. And the result was a trebling of unemployment, was a huge rise in rents, a big attack on pensions, and austerity implemented on a scale that had not been seen since the 1930s. Now, it's not about the personality of those involved. Actually, Wilson and then James Callaghan were to the right of Jeremy Corbyn or John McDonnell. But it's not about the personality of those involved. It's about what happens when governments get into office and try to change things. And don't think this is just about the history of the British Labour Party. Let's look at another recent example you'll be familiar with. In 2015, the Syriza radical left movement was elected in Greece on the back of a huge wave of workers' struggle. Student struggles, occupations of city squares, pensioners' struggles, above all else, because of, you can argue, I asked people in Greece what the real figure is, either 32, 38 or 39 general strikes that took place in the years leading up to the victory of Syriza in 2015. 38, I'd settle for 32 general strikes personally, but huge wave of workers' resistance that took place. Syriza was elected. What was the reaction of the bosses of the European Union, of the International Monetary Fund, and so on? Summed up by the German finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, who said elections cannot be allowed to determine economic policy. No, certainly not. You can't have economic policy decided by the way people vote. That would be very dangerous indeed. And it was seen by these bankers and bosses and financiers and so on that it was necessary to break the anti-austerity government in Greece, because not only would this have an effect on Greece, but it would be a signal to people in Portugal or Ireland or Spain, all of whom are being faced with calls for austerity, that if Greece could escape the net, then why couldn't we as well, by revolting against austerity? And therefore, Greece had to be the demonstration effect. They had to be crushed to discourage the others. That was the programme that was put forward. Syriza, a radical left party with a radical leader, Alexis Tsipras, negotiated for 6 months with the great powers. You know, I don't know if you've ever heard of Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis was the finance minister for all that and writes quite entertainingly about the process that he went on. He wrote at one point, I explained in great detail all my financial plans that I would put forward, and I explained that this could be it was a win-win situation. You can win and we can win, and we can get rid of the debt and we can expand the economy and so on. He said, I might as well have been singing the Swiss national anthem for all that the effect it had upon them. At the end of it, they came back with a package 6 months later, and they put it to a referendum in the summer of 2015, the great Ochi, the no referendum, which led to 61% of people voting to reject the austerity package. But Syriza didn't have an alternative. The banks were saying they would close the cash machines, they said they would cut off foreign exchange, they said they would prevent them being able to make any financial dealings without breaking from the system in a much more fundamental way. They had no alternative. Indeed, revelations show that they desperately hoped that they would lose the referendum and that people would accept the austerity programme, because then they could say, well, we didn't really want it, but you've said yes to it. Anyway, within a week of the referendum, Syriza had accepted a worse austerity package than that pushed through by their Conservative Party predecessors. Now, I don't sit there going, there you are, you people in the Labour Party have got no idea about this. That's not my position at all, right? But we can't just forget the experience of previous Labour governments or the experience of things like Syriza. We have to recognise that something happened here. You know, and Greece is still paying the bankers' bills. Greece is still implementing austerity. And the effect of the 74-79 Labour government was disastrous for workers. The biggest fall in workers' living standards until the recent financial crisis was between 1976 and 1979 in the dying 3 years of that Labour government. That's what led to the winter of discontent, if you've ever heard about it, the mass public sector, workers' strikes, led to the deep disillusion of workers with the Labour Party, and cleared the path for the return of the Tories in 1979 and Margaret Thatcher. So you can't just ignore these things. You can't just say, and it's easy to say, well, we'll move on to someone else now. Someone else can be exciting. We don't talk about Syriza anymore. You have to talk about Syriza. Now, is my case then that there's no point in voting for Jeremy Corbyn on the 12th of December because he'll just betray us all and it will be a disaster and it will clear the way for the return of an even worse government than the one we have at the moment? That's not my position at all. It is to recognise that in the end power doesn't lie in Parliament. That's the fundamental question that's at stake here. Of course elections matter. Of course they do. But the real power is held by those who never offer themselves to a vote or to accountability. Those who own and control the offices, the factories, the call centres and so on. The people who run the banks. The people who determine whether the British government will pay 2% when it borrows money or 8% when it borrows money, with all the effects that will have. These are the people who are really the ones who have the power inside society. And we have to confront that question when a government comes to office. I said to you that the biggest fall in workers' living standards was between 76 and 79 until the recent financial crash. The biggest increase in workers' living standards was between 1970 and 1974 under that government of Ted Heath, which I mentioned earlier, which was a right-wing, nasty government, Tory government. But because the level of struggle was so high, workers' living standards actually rose very sharply. In other words, neither the biggest fall nor the biggest increase were because of those who'd been elected to number 10 Downing Street. That's a real question that we have to confront. The real question is, what is happening at the base of society in terms of the workplaces and on the streets in order to achieve change? And I emphasise, again, my argument is therefore not that I look at Jeremy Corbyn and I say, I've seen that film before. I've seen the film about the Labour government. I've seen the film about Syriza. I know how this ends. That's not the argument at all. Because if you look what will actually happen, I'm not saying that the tanks will roll just because the Labour government gets rid of tuition fees. I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that the generals and so on will try and remove a Jeremy Corbyn government, partly because it will be quite a moderate government in truth compared to some of the ones that were in existence in an earlier period. But there will be huge financial pressure, and the question of whether the government compromises and retreats will be decided not on the electoral plane, but on the plane of resistance in the workplaces and on the streets. And one of my fears is that actually it's slightly harder for the Labour Party in this election than it was in 2017, because the number of retreats and concessions that have already been made. Concessions to the Labour right, for example, in order to keep the unity of the party. It's a sad fact that no one on the Labour right has been deselected by the process of the trigger ballots inside the Labour Party. Some of them have left, but not a single one was deselected. It is a fact that people like Tom Watson and Wes Streeting and Siobhan McDonough and bloody Margaret Hodge were reselected without even the trigger ballot happening. So there have already been huge concessions. And by the way, Tony Blair wrote an article last week in which he said, I'm encouraged by the fact that I know there's quite a lot of Labour MPs who won't vote for the sorts of things in Parliament that Corbyn is talking about. So that's a hurdle that has to be jumped already. And some of the biggest concessions that Labour has already made are around the question of Palestine, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition of what is anti-Semitism, which has essentially criminalised support for the Palestinians inside the Labour Party. And the ditching of Chris Williamson recently was another example of how that's carried through. And I think it demoralises people when they see compromises and retreats rather than confident moving forward around this. And therefore, there will be an immense pressure from the bosses and the bankers and the international institutions on a Labour government. The only thing that will stop the retreats will stop the right being able to shape the outcome and will be able to push beyond what Corbyn and McDonnell want to do, will be if there's a renewed movement on the streets. That's not something that will be conjured up in moments. But one of the reasons why we argue that it's important, even during this election campaign, to support the university UCU union strikes that begin soon, to be on the streets against Donald Trump when he comes, to support the sixth form colleges strikes that are about to happen, to support the South Western Railway strikes that begin at the start of December, and why it's a real shame that there's not going to be a postal workers strike as well at the same time as this, and to be on the streets on the 29th of November for the climate school strike, is because we have to start now the process of a higher level of resistance which will be necessary whoever wins the election. I bitterly hope this doesn't happen, but if the horrendous fact that Johnson wins on the 12th of December, the only thing that will stop the enhanced assault on workers' rights and upon young people's lives is if there is more resistance on the streets and the workplaces. But that will also be needed if Jeremy Corbyn is to beat back against the establishment, the bankers, the bosses and the financial institutions. I feel that British politics is opening up in a profound way. The whole British political class is in crisis. Brexit has torn it apart, the continuing economic crisis across the world, the stagnation that's facing the world economy and the prospect of another deep recession. All of that is opening up the closed areas of British political life. But my argument is it won't be enough to vote. That what's required fundamentally is an assault upon the people who own and control inside society, and that requires building from the base, stronger activity in the workplaces and on the streets, and a set of politics which doesn't rely on Parliament but relies on struggle. Thank you.